Works early so many days and weeks in a row.
Linda Mayer.
She's retired.
Good evening. A special meeting of the Newark City Council. Please come to order. Would you please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which stands one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Let the record show that all members of the City Council are here this evening. The item B is the city manager reports, and we have a study session to review the draft 2022-24 biennial budget. City manager, Mr. Benoon.
Yes, good evening, Your Honor, members of the council. As you indicated, this is a budget work session to discuss the development of our upcoming biennial budget, the 2022 through 2024 biennial budget and capital improvement plan. Tonight, we have a presentation in 5 general areas. First, I'm going to go ahead and give a brief overview of our budget and talk about some key revenue streams. Second, Finance Director Lee will give an update to the council on various economic and revenue projections. Following that, we're going to take a brief pause to discuss council compensation. We have a slide on that, as well as many other requested budget add-on items that staff has. Following that, we'll go ahead and walk through the draft budget document, and at the end, we will conclude by discussing the next steps. So as for the first part of our discussion this evening, just to highlight, we do have 3 key critical revenue streams that I'd like to briefly discuss and touch on. First, we have Measure GG, which, as we all know, was an initiative passed by the voters back in 2016, and it has funded the Civic Center construction project. We're going to go over some slides in regards to the funding revenue we received from that stream, as well as the expenditures related to the Civic Center project. As for Measure PP, just to refresh the council's recollection, as we're all aware, when we planned the previous biennial budget, we had planned for a $14 million budget shortfall, and for the purposes of budgeting, we had not relied on the extension of the UUT. And as we're all aware, back in November of 2020, Measure PP was adopted by the voters, maintaining that UUT at the existing rate of 3.25%. That revenue stream is critical in the sense that it does provide approximately 5% of our revenue and does fund general government programs. And then last but not least, as we're all aware, last year, Congress enacted the American Rescue Plan Act, providing $1 trillion towards economic recovery related to the pandemic, with specifically $11.8 million allocated to the city of Newark. We have half of those funds on hand, and then the other half we expect to receive later this summer. Just to point out, before I forget, Measure PP, that does expire in 2029. Next slide, please. At this point, I want to talk a little bit about Measure GG. The slide in front of you, the yellow is the actuals of what we have received related to Measure GG. The blues on the right are the projected revenue streams that we feel is appropriate based off the information known to us at this time. As you can see, we have only $1 million in 2017. That's obviously because the tax went into effect that year, and it takes a while to receive the revenue from CDTFA. The numbers there on the screen show the increase over the years. Obviously, the dip in 2020, that's in regards to the pandemic, but it is holding steady at $5.7 million. Just straight year-over-year projections, those are there in blue, and that's based off the information we received from our tax consultant. Next slide, please. As we're all aware, we've been using Measure GG to fund the Civic Center construction project. We currently have, we're projected to have at the end of this fiscal year, almost $8 million in that Measure GG account. We're also anticipating receiving approximately $5 million from the escrow account. So this comes from the financing related to the issuance of bonds, and those funds are held up in escrow, and we expect to receive those later this year. That would leave a balance of approximately $13 million, and we anticipate some final closeouts of the Civic Center project in approximately $1.6 million. But what this slide is depicting is you have Measure GG debt service there on the bottom. This is the 2019 Certificates of Participation. That's what COP stands for. These are fixed payments, kind of akin to a mortgage. So you have $4.8 million that we know we will have to pay for the next 5 years. The debt schedule payments do fluctuate. They're based off the bond. And that debt payment schedule does go down lower to the $3 million many years out. What you see at the top there is the yellow is essentially what we've called the excess funds. So in other words, to the extent that we have Measure GG funds that is in excess of what our debt obligation is, those are those numbers right there in yellow. And this is based off the annual payment. So this is what it looks like at this point in time. As we're all aware, Measure GG was a general sales tax, as a general tax, which means the funds can be used for any legitimate governmental purpose. We adopted a policy statement indicating the funds would be used for construction of the Civic Center project and I believe other capital facilities. At this point, in terms of refinancing, that would not make any sense in light of interest rates and where we're at that point, number one. And number two, we would be prohibited under the bond documents to refinance the payments, the COPs, for another 7 years, I believe, something to that effect. So at this point, we'll continue to stockpile those funds and put them in a designated account until we receive further direction from the council as to what should be done with the excess funds. I do note that Assistant City Manager Havorka and Administrative Analyst Ms. Roya Gonzalez are embarking on a capital facilities master plan. It is very clear that there is aging infrastructure in the city that the city owns outside of the Civic Center complex, obviously, and those things, they don't get better over time. Absent some action, those facilities will need some significant upgrades. Ms. Havorka and Ms. Gonzalez, as a part of that process, and this is a project that was funded in the previous capital improvement plan. As part of that process, they will determine basically the status. They'll examine the status of our existing infrastructure and balance the needs of the community present and anticipated needs in the future and what costs of those potential improvements would be. As part of that discussion, this, of course, would be a public process. It would involve stakeholder input from various community groups. Obviously, take it basically through a political process. You hold community meetings and return to the council with draft plans, and obviously the council gives final direction as to that plan. As part of that process, staff would be more than happy to engage the community and ask to what extent the community would want to use Measure GG funds to fund those improvements. So more information later. Next slide is ARPA. I just want to pause for a brief moment and recognize that the federal government did provide us $11.9 million, 11.8. And staff and the council spent a considerable amount of time developing the City of Newark ARPA recovery plan. I just wanted to give a brief update as to where we're at with respect to the expenditure of funds in that plan. So if you may recall, expenditure category, that's there on the left. We used approximately 40% of the plan for revenue replacement and using most of that for restoration of the personnel budget. Council had allocated $3.9 million to be spent over the next few years. We're anticipating, we brought on staff. We're anticipating spending approximately $230,000 at the end of this fiscal year. As for the other part of the revenue replacement, this is the non-personnel budget line item. Those funds have already been accounted for and expended, and the general fund is being reimbursed. That's the $900,000 there. And then the remaining balance of this, 60%, is used for ARPA projects. These are projects that the council and staff have felt would be most appropriate to honor the spirit and intent of the ARPA recovery plan. And so the qualifying categories are there on the left: negative economic impacts, disproportionately impacted communities. The next slide, we talk about public health expenses and so on and so forth. The first item is the small business grants. And as I indicated last time, tremendously proud of our staff for issuing $1.48 million in exceptional COVID grants to various businesses. We have approximately $12,000 in remaining balance, and economic development team is looking at ways to spend those funds. The next item is $300,000 allocation for nonprofit grants. Staff is busy working on a process and procedure that is equitable for all our nonprofits, realizing that they've sustained some losses as a result of the pandemic. We don't anticipate expending those funds in the next 30 days. That's why we have it blank. Chamber of Commerce assistance. Staff is busy working behind the scenes with the Chamber of Commerce, and we hope to have at some point in the near future an agreement for council consideration that would contain some benchmarks and metrics for a successful revival of our Chamber of Commerce. The next item is affordable housing project. Council, if you recall, council allocated $1.5 million towards an affordable housing project. Earlier this year, the council expressed an intent to fund the Cedar Community Apartments project. Those project final approvals would come later this fall if the funding does come from the state, and then $1.5 million would be allocated at that time. The next item is the Newark Resource Center, $1.3 million, which contains programming costs as well as certain improvements to the facility over there, formerly the Head Start building. And right at this point, we've incurred $104,000 in programming costs. Child care and recreation programming scholarships, that's an ongoing expenditure. At this point, we spent a little less than a third of those funds. Next slide, please. Old Town Newark Business Assistance, we don't anticipate spending any of those funds in the next 30 days, but at some point in the next fiscal year, we anticipate doing that. Old Town facade improvements. At this point, we have no funds expended on this, but we do plan well, we have a new senior planner starting on Tuesday, and we're excited that she'll be joining our team, and one of her first projects will be on this. So, and we did use the ARPA funds to restore that position, so we're grateful for that. The next two items are the broadband infrastructure project, so $200,000 to study the existing infrastructure of broadband within our community, and then $1 million for potential implementation. Staff actually, I believe, had a meeting today about that and making progress in that regard. So we hope to have more information soon. The $250,000, this is for software to increase, basically enhance virtual experience of community development users in our community. Council approved the contract for new software, $200,000 at the last council meeting. And I'm also pleased to report that earlier today I signed a contract for TextMyGov, which will include some artificial intelligence and hopefully provide quick customer service to our residents. And so more information on that later. Administrative costs, we've incurred $75,000 to date, and that remains a balance of $25,000. And then the last one is the COVID vaccine incentives, and we're almost done with that one. And these are essentially the gift cards to local businesses. I think we've been focusing on grocery outlets, if I'm not mistaken, and that's what that line item's for. So that concludes my opening comments. Before I pass it over to Director Lee, I'd be happy to answer any questions that the council may have.
Questions, anybody? Councilmember Bucci.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Mr. Badoon. Just real quick, I know we did some rental property grants for folks. I know some of that came from the county and state, but I thought a piece of that came from ARPA. Is that not correct? I didn't see it on here, so I'm just...
Right. Well, we've had a lot of programs, so I could see the confusion. This came from the CARES Act funding. That was where the rental assistance came from, and there was several rounds of CARES Act, so...
Okay, perfect. And then you had briefly mentioned the rate at which we're getting GG at our interest rate and how it doesn't make any sense to refi right now, and obviously it doesn't, but can you remind us what we are, and I know, but for the record, what the interest rate is currently?
Ms. Lee?
The interest rate for the current COPs,
Right.
it's around 2.39. And recently, we've inquired about if we were to issue additional bonds, it's currently at between 5.25 to 5.35%.
Yeah, I knew it had doubled, so that's great. Yeah, no need to change that, so great job. Thank you.
Okay. Vice Mayor Hannan.
Thank you, Mayor. Just two quick questions, and really to refresh my memory. Do we have to expend the ARPA funds by a certain date? I thought there was a certain date certain that we had to expend those funds by.
Yes, I believe it was December of 2025, if I'm not mistaken.
Thank you. We've gone through now the first $11.8 million that we've received. Has council already weighed in on the next $11.8 million?
When the council adopted the ARPA recovery plan, it included expenditures.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor.
Can you tell us a little bit about the broadband master plan, what that would actually entail?
Okay, from the meeting we had today, that was our initial, to see if we had interest and where we would start. We currently don't have any infrastructure in the city of Newark to start this project, so that would be where we would start, is placing the infrastructure throughout the city. Our goals are not only to provide service to city facilities, but to the community at large as well. So the master plan would include an RFP process where we would engage vendors to solicit proposals to put together the master plan for us, with us. And then once that would be in place, which is about a 4 to 6 month process, then we would embark on the infrastructure project.
Okay. And does this include the 5G and fiber?
5G, I know Fremont has recently, they're in their current master planning process, and 5G is the ideal for some of the lines going through that they've put in. So that's what we would hope to offer.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Vice Mayor Hannon.
Let's have a follow-up on that. The broadband infrastructure project, will that incorporate the entire city of Newark or certain areas of Newark that are currently underserved?
So the goal would be to serve the entire community, all areas of the city.
Thank you.
Thank goodness, because I feel I'm underserved right now. Okay, other questions? Anybody? No more questions. City Manager?
All right, thank you, Your Honor. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to Director Lee. She'll go ahead and lead us through the next part of the discussion.
Thank you, City Manager Benoon. If I may, before I start, I'd like to take this opportunity to actually thank the finance team for their day-to-day diligence and their hard work in holding down the fort, especially during this time of the year. We're often juggling the day-to-day functions, making sure bills are paid, issuing paychecks, making sure that we're complying against regulations. And the past 2 years, we've also been juggling a pandemic and the ERP implementation, and that's been added to the routine. So I want to say thank you. I'd also like to give a special acknowledgement to Accounting Manager Ms. Gloria Del Rosario and Senior Accountant Michelle Villanueva, as well as Accountant Ivan Kwong. They've put in many late-night hours in helping compile this document. And, of course, thank you to our city manager for his intelligent leadership, and our assistant city manager, and all of the department heads and the department leads in being collaborative and helping us do this process. And finally, thank you to our mayor and council members, again, for your input and your feedback, and also your leadership in developing the proposed 2022-2024 biannual budget put forth before you tonight. So tonight, I'll begin by giving just a brief update of the current economic environment, followed by an update on our year-end projections. Also, we'll be looking at the proposed 2023 and 2024 budgets and a high-level overview of the 5-year forecast. Please feel free to stop me if anytime any of the council members may have questions. So some of the highlights of the current economic environment since our last budget update is that the GDP, or gross domestic product, is what we know as a monetary value of all the finished goods and services that are produced within a specific period of time. And so GDP is subject to inflation, and we often look at what we refer to as real GDP. And so that's where inflation is adjusted. And so as of the December forecast, the Federal Reserve was projecting GDP to be at 4% for fiscal year 2022. But after the March 16th meeting, the projections were lowered to 2.8. And then according to the more recent updates, they are proposing that the GDP for fiscal year 2023 would be approximately 2.2%, and then at 2% for fiscal year 2024. And then as of the May 4th meeting, the Federal Reserve raised rates by another 0.5 percentage point, and this helped reach their target range of a 1% primary credit rate. This is the rate that the banks charge each other to borrow money and in turn will charge more to lend out the money. Chairman Powell also said that similar increases in the next two Federal Reserve Committee meetings that are scheduled for June and July can be expected as long as the economic conditions remain similar to what they are at right now. The supply chain disruptions are also expected to continue. These disruptions were expected to be temporary, but are now expected to last into fiscal year 2023. With port congestions, rising freight costs, commodities and material shortages, and inflation being of concern. Okay, so inflation currently is at 8.3%, and the highest was in April of at 8.5%. And as you can see at this chart, this is a projection or a historical graph of the past year. The Federal Reserve Committee The Federal Reserve Committee indicated that they will likely continue to raise the rates throughout the year to decrease inflation. That has been pushed upward by the supply chain disruptions. And then further increased by the COVID-related lockdowns in China and the continued Russian attacks on Ukraine. The goal is to have the inflation moderate back to the target rate of 2 to 2.5%. The California housing crisis is still a hot topic. Housing demand in California remains strong. The effects of the rising interest rates have yet to materialize while the statewide median home price sets another record high. In March, the statewide median home price reached a new record high of $849,000, surpassing the previous record of $828,000 that was set back in August of 2021. The March 2022 median price was 11.9% higher than last March, and up 10.1% from a few months ago in February. The Alameda County median home price currently is at $1.2 million, and Newark's median home price is at $1.4 as of March 2022. So we're also on a labor market roller coaster from layoffs, quarantines, resignations, and other factors such as accelerated retirements, widening of the skills gap, and geographic imbalances in the labor market are also causing unusual labor market dynamics. The U.S. labor market is tight and in flux, but the good news is that the Alameda County and Newark's unemployment rate is below the national rate. The national rate of unemployment currently is 3.6, Alameda County is at 2.8, and Newark is at 2.6. And recently, the Silicon Valley Index announced that the Silicon Valley unemployment rate dips to a 2%, which is lowest in 22 years. So low unemployment is usually positive, but high inflation makes that a bad combination. The economy is still very unpredictable. As such, the city will continue to take a cautionary approach to revenue forecasting in accordance with our budget policy. And we will continue to forecast conservatively, but realistically. Even assuming that the economy doesn't head into a recession, however, local governments are having to contend with a wide range of fiscal challenges. Inflation is still at a 40-year high, meaning the cost of service delivery and capital projects will cost more. The tight labor market also means increased personnel cost, including pension cost. So pensions costs varies across the plans within public agencies. It depends on the employer's normal cost, benefit structure, and unfunded liability. The normal cost rate is determined by looking at the annual cost of providing benefits to active employees and is viewed as a long-term contribution rate. The unfunded liability, or the UAL, is determined by looking at the market value of assets of our plan compared with our liabilities. To the extent that the assets are different from the liability, that equals our unfunded liability rate or payment. The purpose is to have the asset equal the liability over time. So in broad terms, a lower liability reduces the total contribution required of the employer. The employer's total pension contribution is the sum of normal costs plus the UAL payment. The overall financial health of the employer's plan is measured by the plan's funded status, which represents the funded assets minus the discounted value of future liabilities. When the discount rate is reduced, it decreases the funded status because basically all the future liabilities have less discounting. The discount rate is a long-term interest rate used to fund the future pension benefits, and it's also known as an assumed rate of return that CalPERS expects from their investments. In the past years, the CalPERS has considered rates as low as 6.25, and more recently, before adopting the 6.8% rate, a 6.5 rate was considered. But then CalPERS settled on the 6.8 to balance out the significant impacts it would have on cities, especially given the negative impacts that the pandemic has already caused. This was the same chart that was presented during the previous budget update, and the table highlights more recent CalPERS changes and the effects that it has on our funded liability. The $10 million ADP had decreased our UAL, and this will be reflected in the upcoming CalPERS valuation report scheduled to be available this July. This report will give us more updated actuarial projections for each of our plans, and there's usually a 2-year lag for these new actuarial valuations to be released and to reflect new rates. So the first ADP payment of $10 million did decrease our UAL by $10 million, and it was paid towards the safety group bases, and this increased the funding level of that plan from 66.3% to 71%. The second ADP of $5 million would be paid towards the miscellaneous group bases, and this will bring the miscellaneous plan's current funding level of 64.6% closer to the safety plan's funding level, approximately 72 to 75%. So the second action was that in 2021, CalPERS did receive very favorable investment gains, about 21%. And what this had done, the effect of this was it decreased our UAL by $44 million. But then the discount rate reduction that was followed shortly, it reduced the discount rate from 7% to 6.8%. And this adopted new actuarial assumptions and increased our UAL by approximately $12.8 million. So when discount rates drop, both the normal cost and the unfunded liability increases. Again, in broad terms, when our UAL decreases, the expected contribution from employers would decrease. But as that increases, then it goes back up. Any questions?
I have a quick question, Mayor.
Vice Mayor Hannon?
So the UAL is projected to decrease by $44 million based on the rate of return that the fund achieved last year. What would then be our projected total liability in this category? If it's decreasing by $44 million, it goes from X to what? Roughly.
So currently, the total unfunded liability of both of our plans is 123 or just these two? Okay. So the total unfunded liability of both of our plans is about $120 million. And then after the $10 million ADP, it decreases that by $10 million and therefore drops to $110 million. And then with the investment gains, it further decreases that about. Yeah, so it further reduces the unfunded liability to $78.4 million.
That's after you add the 12.8?
No, not yet. The 12.8 will be the last, and we would offset that. So we would add 12.8 back to the 78.4.
I'm sorry, I thought you said 110 minus 44 was 78.
Oh,
6.
Yeah, 66.
But then you add the,
oh,
That's
yes,
what I was
my apologies.
asking. That's what I was- yeah.
Yes, that's correct, sorry.
So I just want to make one further comment on this. And again, it's really a credit to this council and to you, Mr. Benoon, and your staff, keeping our eyes focused on this unfunded liability. This is an issue that most cities have not paid particular attention to, and at some point it's going to be a significant impact on the services that they provide. We've taken the opportunity to decrease our unfunded liability on a couple of occasions because we anticipate that if we don't do so, it will have significant impact on our services. So really want to commend you, Ms. Lee, and Mr. Benoon, your staff, for keeping focused on this because it's such an important issue that we need to stay focused on. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions? Okay, this slide just shows a summary of the projected year-end surplus, and we are estimating a surplus of approximately $100,000 after transfers. This is a very high level. We'll be looking at the dollar amounts in further detail in the following slides. This slide shows our general fund reserve balances that are projected for fiscal year end 2022. So at the end of fiscal year 2021, the general fund reserves were above minimal levels of 15% and 10% of final operating expenditures for the emergency reserve and the fiscal uncertainty reserve, respectively. At $11.4 million, the emergency reserve is 17.4% of fiscal year 2021 final operating expenditures, and the fiscal uncertainty reserve at $10.7 million is 16.3% of final expenditures. For fiscal year 2022, the same levels for both reserves will be maintained. The pension and OPEB reserve fund started out with approximately $10.1 million and is estimated to be $4.1 million after the second CalPERS ADP payment of $5 million. Both expected to be, we would also like to make an OPEB funding payment to fund the ACFD OPEBs benefits, and both of these payments will be made in June. The replenishment of the pension and OPEB reserve will also be made at the end of the fiscal year once we close the books and have a better projection of what salary savings would be. The equipment replacement reserve of $6.2 million includes an increase of $200,000 consistent with the current reserve policy. Okay. So this slide shows the current year projections and also the proposed fiscal year 2023 and fiscal year 2024 budgets. In the previous budget update, the general fund revenues were projected at $68.8 million, and expenditures were projected at $65.1 million. The current projection of general fund revenues is $66.7, a decrease of $2.1 million or 3.1% from our March projections. $1.6 million of this $2.1 million decrease is in the licenses, permits, and fees category, and largely due to decreases in recreation program fees. Current expenditure projections of $64.1 million includes a $5 million additional discretionary payment to CalPERS, and that's the ADP. The current expenditure projections is $1 million or 1.5% less than the previous projections and is largely due to personnel costs. The current projections were, The previous projections were also accounting for vacancies being filled, but that did not materialize. With the updated projections, we are anticipating a surplus of approximately $100,000 after transfers. Notable transfers for fiscal year 2022 includes a transfer in of $2.3 million from the pension reserve to fund another pay down of our unfunded pension liability, and $1.3 million is transferred in from the ARPA funds to fund ARPA eligible expenditures. $5.7 million of Measure GG revenue is shown as a transfer out and is designated for Civic Center related capital projects and for debt service payments. $200,000 of transfers out to the equipment replacement reserve, and $250,000 is transferred out to capital projects fund. And this is also per the year-end fund balance policy, which staff will be proposing updates to in fiscal year 2023. So the last two columns are the proposed fiscal year 2023 and 2024 budgets. We continue to face a fair amount of uncertainty, but we are in much better shape than expected at the start of the pandemic. Although some revenues have been impacted more significantly than others, the overall impact was not as drastic as what we anticipated when we adopted the previous biannual budget. The proposed biannual budget takes into consideration the current state of the local, regional, national, and global economies. This budget also considers the following factors. The first is that the pandemic is transitioning into a controlled phase. COVID-19 is not going away, but each successive wave causes less economic disruption, and as businesses and households will continue to adapt. It also assumes that the economic fallout from the geopolitical tensions in Eastern Europe will be contained, and that the fallouts in terms of rising oil prices, commodities, and rising agricultural prices will be resolved. Finally, it assumes that the Fed, with its work in normalizing and raising interest rates, will succeed in calming the inflation without pushing the economy into a recession. So there have been some upsides to all of the economic shifts. Inflation, on one hand, causes concern, but on the other hand, it also contributed to some increases in sales tax revenues. And the hot housing market has also paid into the dividends. Most revenues, except for the TOT, or the transient occupancy tax, and the recreation program fees have fully recovered and are expected to be at or above pre-pandemic levels in fiscal year 2023 and 2024. Tourism did pick up, but business travel is still lagging. Newark's TOT is more dependent on business travel customers. The current occupancy rates are 62.1% through the end of March 2022, which is slightly higher than the 58% at the end of fiscal year 2021. But this is still lower than the 66% occupancy rate at the end of fiscal year 2020. Prior to the pandemic, occupancy rates were more at 81%. For our year-end projections, we observed a slower than anticipated return for revenue related to the recreation program fees as a result of decreased use of the Silliman Center, facility rentals, child care enrollment, and recreation classes. For the most part, development activity is projected to be steady, but expecting to level off in the future as certain large development projects are completed. And public works services and building permits will remain consistent with prior year amounts due to community needs. Also, we're expecting to receive another $5.9 million, which is the second tranche or an allocation from the ARPA funds in July. The proposed appropriations for fiscal year 2023 and 2024 include maintaining essential services and specific requests from departments. The personnel category reflects a general salary increase of 1.5% for fiscal year 2023 and 2.75% for fiscal year 2024, with a vacancy factor of 7% each year. The proposed budget also includes an increase in the ACFD, or Alameda County Fire Services contract, which City Manager Benoon will be covering in more detail later in this presentation. The non-personnel category is comprised of expenditures for material supplies and professional and contractual services. The proposed budgets for this category includes reinstatement of contract services, departmental supplies, and employee training. And also inflationary increases between 2 to 3% are also built in. This category also includes our internal service allocations for equipment replacement, equipment and building maintenance, workers' comp, and public liability costs. Because we have a beautiful new building, there was a significant increase in the building maintenance and the public liability cost. The increase in the building maintenance also includes increases in utility costs. Internal service allocations did increase significantly due to these increases, but to soften the impact to the general fund, we're spending down the fund balances that were accumulated in these funds in previous years. So in summary, the proposed 2023 and 2024 budgets reflect stable revenues and a balanced budget.
I have a couple of questions, Ms. Lee, on that last slide, if I may. The sales tax revenue for 23-24, does that include the new Costco facility, or that's not included there?
It's not included.
Okay, so that's certainly good news that we can anticipate down the road. You mentioned the occupancy rate at our hotels is around 62%. Do you have an idea as to what the average room rate is, what it has been and where it is today?
I do not have that information at hand. I will connect with our economic development manager and provide that after the meeting.
Thank you.
Okay, so reflected here in this pie chart are the general fund revenue sources. Property tax and sales tax are the largest slices of the pie. Property tax is the general fund's largest revenue source and is estimated at $27.3 million and is 39% of the revenue source. Sales tax, constituting the general fund's second largest revenue source, is projected to be $14.5 million and is 21% of total revenues. Measure GG, the half-cent sales tax, is projected to be at $6 million, and this is 9% of our total revenues. The transient occupancy tax has been severely impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, and the revenues are projected to be at $3.8 million for fiscal year 2023, which is still 43% below the pandemic level. The UUT, utility users tax, so City of Newark imposes a UUT on the use of cable, electric, gas, wired telecom, and wireless telecom services at a rate of 3.25. In November of 2020, Newark voters approved Measure PP, extending the city's UUT current rate for 9 years. The UUT generates about 5% of the general fund's revenue, and so for fiscal year 2023, we're projecting to receive approximately $3.3 million. The licenses, permits, and fees category is projected to end the year at $10 million and is currently 14% of total revenues. This category includes franchise fees, recreation program fees, animal licenses, construction permits, encroachment permits, and building permits. The other category includes property transfer tax, business license tax, fines and forfeitures, and intergovernmental revenues. This category is 6% of our total revenues. So this is the pie chart for fiscal year 2024. As you can see that the proportions remain similar and there's no significant adjustments that are expected in the revenues between the 2 years. This pie chart represents the expenditures by category. On an average, personnel costs are about 53% of the budget, since most of what local government does is to provide services. The city contracts with Alameda County Fire for services, and this is 18% of the budget. The remaining 29% is non-personnel costs, which includes materials, supplies, services, and internal service allocations. Like the revenue, the proportions of the expenditure categories between the 2 years are very similar.
I have a quick question on that last chart, Ms. Lee. Many cities do expend about 70 to 73% on personnel, and that's what you're indicating here. Personnel, 53 plus the fire, about 73%. Is that number growing in terms of the expenditure side over the last 5 years? Are we seeing a significant increase in the personnel costs and less on the non-personnel? Or do you have any information on that?
The number does grow, but in terms of significant, it typically would grow according to the increases based off of the MOUs. And then, of course, pension cost. So in terms of significant, I don't think it's out of the ordinary. What I did see is that before we had contract fire services, it was closer to the 70 percentile that other cities are probably showing.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So the high-level overview of the 5-year forecast, we are showing modest increases in revenues, and revenues are forecasted with strong property tax and sales tax increases. The 5-year forecast projects that revenue growth is between 3.8 to 4.1 year over year. This growth is a composite of a year-over-year 6% growth in property taxes, 3% in sales tax, and 2.3% in TOT, and an average of 2% for all other revenue sources. Expenditures are forecasted to grow about 2.7% in fiscal year 2023, and then 4.2% in fiscal year 2024. The two big factors for the expenditure growth are the year-over-year increase in personnel costs plus the fire contract, increases in the fire contract. This multi-year forecast provides a long-range financial outlook that assists in planning and decision-making in connections with the financial operations of the general fund. The forecast is updated a minimum of 2 times a year during the budget development and then at mid-year. The forecast has been updated to provide projections for fiscal year 2023 through 2027. Included are several footnotes providing additional explanations for specific transfer items. I state here that the personnel costs does include vacancy factors, and so for fiscal year 2023-2024, the vacancy factor is 7%, and for the out years, it's currently 5%. Starting in 2024, the general salary increases that were included is 2.75%. And then also, what we also show is the transfers in from the ARPA fund for for fiscal year 2023 and for fiscal year 2024, as well as the transfer out for Measure GG revenues that's designated, again, for debt service and civic center capital projects. So overall, the revenues are conservatively forecasted with increases. Property and sales tax are showing growth, while other revenues are lagging growth due to the impacts of the pandemic and change in behavior affecting hotel occupancy and participation in recreation events. A long-term economic slowdown or another adverse economic event would significantly change the forecast, which is why it's updated throughout the year. Overall, expenditures are forecasted with an average increase of 3.3%. The biggest drivers of increasing costs are salaries, benefits, pensions, and fire services. The last two drivers are not within the control of the city. Impacts of future negotiations with bargaining groups have not yet been included in the forecasted years, and the other similar scenarios have not been forecasted. Furthermore, the general fund could be additionally impacted by losses in revenues or demands for services in other operating funds. For example, ARPA funding has ongoing expenditures appropriated, but this funding will be exhausted by December of 2024. Because the budget is a dynamic document, the forecast should also be seen as a dynamic tool. In addition to the concerns discussed above, the current pandemic and related economic situation and any other problems with the global or local economy or unknown mandates from the state could dramatically change the projections provided. After tonight's meeting, staff will accept input, feedback, and any changes or directions from council and would compile and build these into the final budget document for council's adoptions on June 23rd. And that concludes my presentation. Be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you.
Just a quick question,
Yes, Councilmember Freitas?
Ms. Lee, can we go back to the pie, okay. When you're showing 53% of personnel and non-personnel 27% on the pie, can you give me an illustration of the non-personnel, the 27%, what's included there?
Oh, absolutely. The non-personnel includes our operating costs, which is materials, supplies, services, and also our internal service allocations.
Okay, so, okay. Okay, thank you.
Couple follow-up, Mayor?
Yes, Councilmember Hannah.
Thank you, Mayor. Ms. Lee, I've heard or read that the state is looking to provide additional funding to local governments. Have we factored in any additional funding from the state government over the next year or two?
We have not. We don't really have an accurate number to work off of, and we'll definitely provide that as that number is available.
The other issue I'm concerned about, by the way, I think we're doing exceptionally well on our budget. The revenues look great. The expenditures are well in line. I think Mr. Benoon and your staff are doing a great job on this budget moving forward. Any thoughts, or give me your thoughts on expanding the library hours? I know we did cut the library hours as a result of the revenue issues that we were dealing with. Has there been any discussion on what that might cost and what that might look like?
Sure. I think the cost of the Sunday hours are approximately $150,000 the last time we looked at it. We did engage the library as part of the budget preparation process, and the numbers in terms of attendance at that facility are, of course, still lower than where they were prior to the pandemic, but I am happy to report that they are trending in the right direction. So I think as we get closer to those levels, we can certainly evaluate at that time. The cost is relatively inexpensive in comparison, I think, to the benefit that the community receives, but we're definitely on that right path. And so I think once we get to that appropriate time, more than happy to bring forward a budget amendment and related contract.
Just to put a placeholder on that, Mr. Benoon, maybe we can get an update on that situation maybe in the next several months in terms of where we might stand in terms of maybe as we get closer to the beginning of the school year. Thank you, Mayor.
I think I'd like to ask the audience if we have any comments from the audience. Anybody like to speak on this? Anybody? And Ms. Harrington, anybody at home?
Nobody on Zoom.
No? Okay. So then other comments from the council? Anybody? No? Okay.
Your Honor, we do have some more slides.
Okay.
If I could go through those. If we have more questions, we'd be happy to answer them at this time, but we do have a few more slides, if that's
Sure.
okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. So we take the existing budget that we have, and then we go ahead and build in additional costs. We use the amended budget as the baseline, and we take into account the direction council provided at the last budget workshop, back in February, and that includes the goals and objectives for all of our departments. So tonight I'm just going to walk through a few additions. Again, this is on top of the baseline, which again is the amended budget. So I have a few department requests for add-ons. The first one is information systems. Later this evening, Assistant City Manager Havorka will provide the council with a report for recommendation to reorganize that division into a full department and rebrand it as the Information Technology Department. But regardless of council's, I think, direction on that one, those numbers have not been incorporated into this budget. Once council provides a direction on that, we'll make a related budget amendment request. But as for tonight, I think for this purpose of this meeting, regardless of whether or not the council provides that direction, we do have some increased costs that we have to address. One is computer licensing and software costs. Those numbers are going up, excuse me, and that's reflected in the table there. We also have increased temporary staffing needs, $180,000 and $100,000 for year two, and that's because of the vacancies in staff that we have at this point. and then increased telecommunication costs, and this is essentially the cost of doing business. The next department is our police department. As I indicated a few months ago, we do face a vacancy of 8 police officers. It is incredibly difficult to attract and hire new police officers, despite the amazing facility we have and the wonderful police leadership. This is unfortunately the experiences that all of our neighboring jurisdictions are having. And so as a result, we really need to take some action to address that issue. The first line item is for recruitment marketing costs. These include costs for I think a booth in year 1, a marketing booth, and a bunch of marketing materials, printing materials, that sort of thing. The second line item is recruitment incentives. So this would be for any lateral police officer that comes from another jurisdiction over to the city of Newark, that officer be paid essentially a signing bonus of $18,000, which is consistent with what other jurisdictions are providing. We factored out $72,000 as essentially, well, if we have 8 vacancies, perhaps half of those would come from laterals, the other half we would put through the academy. The next line item is PD referral incentives for $20,000 for each fiscal year. This would be essentially a referral to the extent any existing staff member would be able to recommend a potential applicant who does ultimately get hired. That person would receive a referral fee of $2,500, which I believe is a slight increase. Previous amount was $1,500, I believe, on the referral, and this would be up to $2,500. And so we factored in essentially 8 vacancies, and that's how you get to the 20. Travel costs, this would be for staff to go over for universities, wherever they have to go to essentially locate potential applicants. So that would be academies, universities, that sort of thing. PD strategic planning workshop, this is an added line item. This would provide for strategic planning for our command staff on a yearly basis to ensure that the department is headed in the right direction. And the last item is hotel costs for PD trainees. This is something that the city was in the city's operating budget, but was removed as part of the cost reduction measures implemented in response to the pandemic. So this would be a reinstatement of that line item. So essentially pay for the police trainees when they go to the academy. We'd essentially be paying for their hotel fees. And again, this is, I think, consistent with what other jurisdictions are providing. So those are the total costs right there at the bottom for year 1 and year 2, respectively. The next department is our fire department. This is part of our contractual obligations per our agreement with Alameda County Fire Department. We do have an increase of almost $500,000 there for the first fiscal year. This is like everything in our society, costs are going up. So the $500,000 does include vendor costs, non-personnel operating costs, but it largely consists of personnel costs. Year 2 of our fiscal budget, of our biennial budget is $1.3 million, and that's because there's increased costs for the year over year from 23 to 24. So essentially any pay increases compound over time. So that $1.4 million is compared against the existing baseline that we have here today, which is the amended 22 budget. And then I believe the last one is community development. We have $75,000 for environmental consultant fees for the first fiscal year, and then $80,000 for the second fiscal year. And these are essentially for projects that do require environmental review or assistance that are not funded by the developers. So for example, we may face CIP projects that would require environmental CEQA review, as well as policy changes that we need to implement in response to ever-changing CEQA law. That type of consultant expertise and assistance costs approximately that amount of money, so we request that be added to the budget. We're also recommending that community development staff go through a full development impact fee study. Basically, some of those fees were adopted. They are all adopted at various times, and some of them are getting closer, I think, to that 10-year mark. So now would be the appropriate time to evaluate where we're at with those impact fees, do the nexus studies, and see if those are truly remain today what they were back then. So that cost of that analysis would be $75,000. And then last but not least, we have summary abatement services with the hiring of our community preservation manager. He's recommending an add-on. This is not something we've had, at least as far as I've been here. So it'd be a provision that would allow code enforcement to exercise summary abatement should that be necessary. So that would include, for example, weed abatement, some extraordinary action where the city would need to step in, we'd be able to pay for those costs, and then we would lien the property owner. It could also be used for boarding up the property in exigent circumstances, things of that nature. So that's what we have for community development. Here's the cumulative slide showing the final numbers there at the bottom. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and pause. Be happy to answer any questions that the council may have. After we're done with this section, I'll pass it over to Ms. Savorka, and she can talk about one potential last budget add-on. So,
I guess one question I would have is, what does this bring the total Alameda County Fire Services contract to?
I believe it would raise, with this cost for this next fiscal year, it would be $11.8 million, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Vice Mayor Hannan?
Yes, following up on the mayor's question, as we look at public safety in general in terms of our ability to retain and get staff, where are we at with the Alameda County Fire Department? Are they facing the same challenges in terms of staffing and keeping staff and things of that nature?
Your Honor, council members, thank you. I can help with that a little bit. Our staffing numbers are looking good. We've recently conducted a promotional assessment for the rank of division chief, company officer, and as well as battalion chiefs. Our lists are looking very good. The vacancies we currently have should be filled within the next month and a half, and I project that we will be keeping up with the staffing levels at this point.
Excellent.
Okay.
Thank you. And the last comment, I'm sorry.
Don't leave. I have one more question. Are we adding additional mentor staff here in Newark, our houses?
Are we adding, repeat that?
Additional firefighters to our staff here?
As of right now, we are not adding any additional members to what we currently have, which is 3 members at each station, if that answers your question. There has been talk of a need that I've been hearing, and I'm not sure where it originated from, but of adding a 4th person to the truck house at Station 28.
28?
That is something that the city wants to move forward with. We definitely would entertain looking into that and coming up with numbers and a plan to put that in place.
Thank you.
Thank you. My other question regards the summary abatement process, Mr. Benoon. I welcome that. Summary abatement is used when we have an emergency, exigent circumstance, when we need to take care of a property issue immediately. And I think it just makes our community and our neighborhoods safer. So thank you for bringing that forward.
Okay, other questions? Councilmember Bucci?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The impact fee study, I thought we did a Nexus study about 4 or 5 years ago, and the result of that was to tie it to the consumer price index so that it automatically kind of climbed year after year, so we weren't doing the hopscotch thing every several years. Is that accurate?
So yes, I believe most of our fees do have some escalator built into them. I can't recall, as I sit here now, which ones we examined 4 years ago. Some of them, I don't remember exactly which ones we put in 4 years ago, but most of them do have escalators in them. I think putting that off to the side is still a good idea every now and then, not necessarily on an annual basis, but every now and then to take a look at it, do the proper study, and make that determination of whether or not they're within, if they're essentially they're recovering what they're intended to do. So there are built-in escalators in them.
I suppose it came up because we were discussing the park impact fees at the time, and I thought it was a complete development impact fee study that we got from the developers, but I guess it wasn't.
Did they hit a couple of development fees in that one? Or was it just park? Okay.
It was just parks? Okay. Okay, very good, thank you.
Okay, other questions? Nope. Carry on.
All right, getting closer to the end. This slide here, I'm going to defer to Assistant City Manager Havorka. She's going to give you some background information related to compensation for the council and receive direction from the council as to what amendments should be made to our budget, if any. Ms. Havorka.
Okay. Good evening, Your Honor and City Council members. Excuse me. I will try to get through this without coughing on you. anymore. Each biennial budget cycle, the city council may consider increases to the mayor's and the council members' salaries per our municipal code. That code states that the consumer price index and any increases in compensation awarded to city staff since the last increase to council member salaries should be considered. The current salaries, which were last increased on January 1, 2019, are in the dark blue box here. For council members, it's $1,247 per month, and for the mayor, it is $2,727 per month. Government code also provides a cap on council member salaries at 5% per calendar year since the last increase, and does not allow the increases to take effect until after the next election. So since the last increase was provided in 2019, a maximum of 15% increase may be considered. That would include calendar years 2020, 2021, and 2022, if you were to consider an increase going into effect January 1, 2023, or later. So the table here shows the increased salaries if the cap of 15% were applied at the end of the table there. It also shows, starting from the left here, a 1.5% increase, which is the most recent increase city staff received in 2021. 3% equals the total amount of staff increases in fiscal years 2019, 2020, and 2021. Increases for 2022 have not yet been determined. And then the 5% column is shown as the one-year cap amount per government code. 10% is shown as the two-year cap amount, as well as the total of the consumer price index figures for February 2020, 2021, and 2022 combined. It was actually 9.7%, rounded up to 10% is the numbers there in the table. So if the council would like to increase salaries for the mayor and/or council members, staff would include the increase in the 2022-2024 biennial budget and return to council later this year with an ordinance amendment to effect that change. This concludes staff's report, and I will pause here and ask for direction from the council, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay. Of course, this is always a awkward situation for, you know, it's like, was it the chickens watching the hen house or something? Something like that. But yeah, I mean, it's just an awkward conversation that we must have. And, you know, I would just start out with, and I'm talking for our council members and, you know, the amount of work that they do, the time that they give up. People don't realize that when we have meetings like this and they have to be here early, you're taking your time off of your job and you don't get paid for that. You know, I know when I was a council member, by the time it came time to go on vacation, I didn't have any vacation time left, and you know, I was you know, working or taking a vacation without any funds. So I would, you know, I don't know what the percentage is, but I would certainly support increasing council salaries. Vice Mayor Hannan.
Thank you. Thank you for the report. As the mayor mentioned, this is always an awkward subject, but I'm always willing to have it. Refresh my memory, this city council did not have a pay raise between 2008 and 2019. Is that correct?
I believe that's correct.
So there really was no mechanism in place, as I recall, for councils to periodically review the council salary, the mayor's salary, to ensure that we're keeping up at least with the time commitment necessary to do the job that our residents expect us to do. I think the mayor's points are right on, but what the mayor neglects to mention is the significant amount of time that we spent representing our community, not only in neighborhood events, business events, but also as members of various committees representing the city of Newark, many of those to which we receive no compensation for either, including traveling, et cetera, et cetera. I think what I heard you say is the 3% increase would basically encapsulate the pay raises that staff received between 2019 and 2022. Did I hear that correctly?
Yes, that would be the 3% figure.
Yes, I certainly would never want to be in a situation where we're getting more of an increase than our staff are receiving. That would not be prudent. So my recommendation, and I don't know if you need any kind of a formal mention it, but I would recommend that we look at raising the council and the mayor's salaries 3%. Thank you, Mayor.
Your Honor,
Councilmember Collazo?
I just wanted to state that as members of the council, we also looked at the fact that we're not going to be here forever. And when somebody looks at the salary that we're getting, they're not encouraged to run for our seats here. And so we do want people to feel like they're encouraged to run because they're going to be supplementing their salaries that they have. So that's one of the reasons too that we thought that we should do the, not that we're getting rich, but that we want to encourage other people to run for our seats.
Okay, thank you. Other comments? Councilmember Bucci?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just real quickly, we have a tradition here in Newark where we've, when we've done contracts and things, that a rising tide raises all boats, and it's been pretty equal. So I would say that I would agree with the Vice Mayor's comment that if we're going to, look at an increase, it should be in line with what our employees have gotten over the last few years, since that's how we've traditionally done it. And it works. So I would support the look at the 3%. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, other comments? None? Does that give you direction on, you need a formal vote?
We do not. That provides the direction I need. Thank you.
Okay.
All right, thank you, Your Honor. At this point, I'm just going to take a quick walk through the document. We provided, speaking of overtime, I know we provided you guys last week with the draft 300-page document. At this point, I'd like to pause and ask if there's any questions about any of these sections. The first 8 pages are the introduction section, overview pages 9 through 12. We have the 5-year forecast 13 through 14, explanation of the budget structure 44 through 50, financial summaries in 52 through 71, and personnel section 72 through 77. Any questions relating to any of those sections?
Vice Mayor Hanna.
Thank you, Mayor. First of all, I want to, again, thank you, Mr. Benoon, and your staff for an outstanding budget presentation. I am so pleased that this council, before my time, decided to look at this budget process on a 2-year basis. It's such a painful process in government when you do this on an annual basis. It's pretty much every day during that annual period, so you never escape the budget process. So I think it's very forward-looking to do it on a 2-year basis. The only question I had as I read the document was on page 34, we had roughly 584 of our businesses that were currently delinquent on their business tax. And that represents probably 20% or so of those businesses throughout the city of Newark. Just want to kind of get an understanding as to our strategy to kind of hopefully encourage those delinquent businesses to pay their business tax. Thank you, Mayor.
Ms. Lee, if you could answer the Vice Mayor's question, please.
Yes, Vice Mayor Hannon, we currently do not have a distinct program, but we do have a process where staff on a monthly basis does send out friendly reminders, follow-ups, and then we also make phone calls, or we would also connect via email. We also try to inform the business of our ordinance policies, and more recently, we've been able to also help the businesses and refer them to our economic development manager, who also has other resources that are available to help encourage making payments of the delinquent. And the amount that we currently reference in the budget document was at the time of the writing. But more currently to date, actually, that number has decreased to about 450 businesses, and so we are making progress.
Just to follow up on Ms. Lee and Mr. Benoon, of those 450 roughly businesses, again, we're coming out of a pandemic where many of them have struggled significantly. And I know that we apply financial penalties for non-payment of the tax on time, which is the fair thing to do. Does the city manager, do you have discretion to waive those penalties based on good cause for a business that might demonstrate that they have struggled over these last year or two as a result of the pandemic?
Sure. Business license fees are regulated by the city's municipal code. It's fairly formulaic in terms of the process you have to go through to waive that. I believe it's within the city clerk's discretion, but that is fairly limited, I think up to a certain point in time. And at that point, she would be constrained to waive those fees. And back in 2020, we did adopt a resolution to waive penalties. And if that's the council's desire, we can certainly look into it. I think Ms. Lee's more than happy to do some analysis to take a look and see to what extent the pandemic has had an impact on the payment of business license fees for this year. I believe most of our licensees did tender their payment within reasonable time periods in 2021, if I'm not mistaken. So we're gonna have to take a look and see to what extent, what's going on here, because this clearly is, I think, more than what we've experienced in the past in terms of late fees at this point in time.
And I certainly wouldn't discourage you from making that analysis and coming back to the council, because it's not a significant amount of dollars that we're talking about in terms of the penalties. So if you believe after doing an analysis that it might be prudent to go ahead and continue that waiver of the penalties for these businesses to help them continue to operate, I certainly wouldn't be opposed to having you look into that. Thank you, Mayor.
Mm-hmm. As a follow-up request on the business licenses, could you, as a part of your study, tell us what the average cost is for a business license in Newark?
Sure, be happy to do that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, other questions on this? Nope.
All right, we have one last slide, maybe two, sorry. Here are the last sections of the budget. We have general fund department summaries, development cost center, recreation community cost center, maintenance cost center, capital funds, internal service allocations. The CIP was intentionally omitted. We did not have time to incorporate that into the draft budget since our last work session was last Thursday. The final budget book, of course, that is presented to the council on June 23rd would include the finalized CIP. And then last but not least, we have the glossary. Happy to pause here. If there's any questions from the council, I'm more than happy to provide responses.
Questions? Nope.
All right, as for next steps, as I indicated, we will schedule this matter for public hearing on June 23rd for final adoption. That obviously will take effect in fiscal year 2023, starting on July 1st of 2022. So that concludes staff's presentation this evening, Your Honor. It is 6:56. I wasn't sure how long you wanted to have an intermission. I know we have a 7 o'clock meeting, so.
Okay. Well, before we do that, I'd like to ask the public if they have any input they'd like to make to this subject. Anybody in the audience like to speak on this? And then I'll ask the City Clerk Harrington, is anybody at home again?
No, sir.
Okay. Okay, so with that, and there's no other comments, I think we are adjourned. Thank you.